In the hidden ending of Auberzone's minigame called White Memory, it was revealed that after the Goddess Squad parted ways in the event story, Snow White went to Lilith's grave to say some final words to her former leader before starting her journey. But instead of the scene that Dorothy described earlier in Auberzone's event story of Lilith looking so peaceful inside her coffin as if she was sleeping, what greeted Snow White is a scene straight out of her worst nightmares. Because upon her arrival, Snow White discovered that the grave has been desecrated, and inside the shattered coffin, only Lilith's body remained. Her head is missing. And so Snow White desperately searched her surroundings for any signs of her former leader's head, or at least any hints that could reveal who's responsible for this. And after seeing the black scalp marks on the white lilies and hearing the sound of machines echoing from somewhere, Snow White immediately realized who the culprits are. It's the Raptures. They took Lilith's head. Now, many of us assume that the reason why the Raptures took Lilith's head is because they used it to turn Lilith into the Rapture Queen. Because as Nihilister stated in her Bond story, all heretics including the Queen went through a process where their bodies are reconstructed into their ideal forms. But what separated the Queen from the normal heretics is that the Queen's original body wasn't consumed during this process, and instead her original body was left somewhere on the surface. And of course, Nihilister also revealed that this original body is the key to defeating the Queen.
I have a plan. One that I've been planning for a long time. Perhaps you've heard of Lilith's body. The Queen's predecessor, and the only thing she neglected to take care of during her time on the surface. If Lilith's body can be found, I will be able to kill the Queen!
So it makes sense to assume that the Raptures used Lilith's head to turn her into the Queen. But this raises a very obvious question: why only take Lilith's head and leave her body behind? Because if the Rapture's plan is to turn her into the Queen, then don't it make more sense to just upgrade her already overpowered body with Rapture parts, like what they normally do to regular heretics? So I've always been curious on the possible reason why the Raptures left Lilith's body behind, but so far all the explanations that I came up with fell short. But after reading all the information revealed in these recent events and coming up with theories about them, I realized that we might be wrong. The Raptures didn't turn Lilith into the Queen. Instead, what they most likely did is the opposite. They turned the Queen into Lilith. Let me explain. Now, we already know from Rappy and Reddit's case that it's possible to turn a Nikke into another individual by putting that individual's personality data into the Nikke's nymph. But of course, it can't just be any nymph. It has to be a nymph that is empty. And I say this because we know that the reason why Rappy caught Deep's attention is because Deep noticed that Rappy's nymph was empty.
My goodness, there's really nothing inside her. Frankly, I'm stunned at how little there is.
Are you talking about her chest? I mean, sure, she's flat, but I don't think it's that bad.
Quiet.
What are you doing?
I haven't worked on either mass-produced models or Grim models before. This could be a good opportunity.
And it makes sense that you can't input the data of another person's personality into a nymph that already has a personality data written into it. So I think it's fair to assume that an empty nymph is required for this to work. And it can also explain why none of the big three was able to replicate this process, because it's probably difficult to find an individual whose nymph is completely empty. Because even though the people who are turned into mass-produced Nikkes are those who lack ideal visions of themselves, none of the mass-produced Nikkes that we've got to know so far are completely empty. All of them have things that defines them. They have dreams, places they want to go, and people they want to become. It's just not strong enough for them to become specialized models. But what does this have to do with the Queen becoming Lilith? Well, if we consider the minor similarities between Raptures and Nikkes, the existence of heretics, and the fact that Chatterbox was able to transform into Nihilister, then it's safe to assume that the Raptures can be turned into Nikkes as well if they meet the right conditions. And we saw the Queen in the Old Tales event, and the first thing I've noticed when I saw her is that her humanoid part looks like a mass-produced Nikke. Now, we know that the reason why Rappy was turned into a mass-produced model is because her nymph was empty, so it's possible that this is also the case with the queen. But of course, we've already discussed earlier that being a mass-produced model doesn't necessarily mean that the Nikke, or in this case the queen, is completely empty. But after seeing how the queen behaved during her fight against Cinderella, I'll be honest, it didn't feel like she has a sense of self. It didn't even feel like she has a human-level intelligence. I mean, it didn't seem like she can speak like Chatterbox, because all she did was make Rapture noises during her fight against Cinderella. She also didn't make any effort to dodge or block any of Cindy's attack. She just tanked everything and fired her own laser beams. Basically, she behaved like your typical Rapture, or as the words written on her chest say, it's as if she's soulless. So if we combine the queen's appearance resembling a mass-produced Nikke with her soullessness, then I think it's safe to say that just like Rappy, the queen is also empty. Meaning that you can put the personality data of another individual into the queen's nymph or whatever its Rapture equivalent is, and she will transform into that individual. After all, the queen's complete lack of personality could have made it easier for her to make another individual's personality into her own. So what the Raptures most likely did to Lilith's head is that they took it because they wanted to make a copy of Lilith's personality data that is stored in her nymph, which they then written into the queen's nymph. And I have no doubt that the Raptures can do this because again, the corruption code is a personality data that they enter into a Nikke's nymph. So putting Lilith's personality data into the queen should be a simple task for them. And transferring Lilith's personality data to the queen's body will not only explain how she could have become the Rapture Queen, because it also explains how the Raptures could have brought her back to life. Because again, she was already confirmed dead for at least a month before the Raptures took her head, and right now this method of transferring personality data is the only possible way of bringing a dead Nikke back to life. And Lilith wouldn't be the only Nikke that the Raptures resurrected, because Marion was also confirmed dead in chapter 1, but she was able to return to us as a heretic/queen. So it's possible that the Raptors also revived Marion by transferring her personality data into another body, and I see this being the case because again, Marion is a Rapture Queen. So what Niles just said about the queen's original body not being consumed in the creation process might also apply to Marion as well. So right now, I really think that the possible reason why the Raptors didn't take Lilith's body is because they don't need it to turn her into the queen, and all they needed from her is her personality data, which is stored inside her head, specifically her nymph. And since Nilaser stated that the queen was also a corrupted Nikke before her ascension, then I assume that Lilith's personality data that the Raptors took is one that has been mixed with the corruption code, which could explain why Lilith would accept the role of the queen. Because that's what the corruption does, it convinces Nikkes that their true mission is to serve the queen, although in this case it will convince Lilith that her true mission is to become the queen. But there's another possibility, because we know that when Rappy evolved, she was no longer trying to become Red Hood, and instead what happened is Rappy followed Graves' advice and only inherited parts of who Red Hood is.
You believed that to carry on Red Hood's legacy, you had to become her. There must be a reason for that. What did Red Hood live for? What did she aspire towards? What is it about her that you found worthy of inheriting? What kind of person was Red Hood to you? You know the answer. Choosing which parts to inherit from her and finding your own path. That is succeeding.
Grave.
Stay strong. You are beautiful. Stay that way.
So by only inheriting certain parts of who Red Hood is, Rappy was able to become her own version of Red Hood. So it's also possible that instead of fully inheriting the personality of corrupted Lilith, the queen only inherited parts of Lilith's personality, turning her into her own version of Lilith, one that's filled with maternal instinct. And personally, I preferred the idea of the Queen only inheriting parts of Lilith's personality instead of Lilith fully resurrecting into the Queen's body. Because even if Lilith got corrupted, I doubt that the corruption can convince her to become the Queen. After all, if the corruption was unable to completely break Cindy's will, then I doubt that it can break the will of the strongest Nikke to ever exist. So I think that it makes more sense for the Raptures to only take parts of Lilith's personality data to create their own Lilith, their own goddess of victory.